So, this isn't an attack on emergency management or the dedicated professionals who serve communities every day. It's a call for the kind of difficult self reflection that mature professions must undertake when external pressures reveal internal contradictions that can no longer be ignored. And this conversation will likely be uncomfortable for many, but I think it really needs to happen anyway. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crisis Lab podcast. I'm Colin. I'll be your host. And this article today is something that we published on LinkedIn some time ago, but I wanted to bring it back up in our podcast format because the conversation is still happening and I think it's a worthwhile discussion. And so when I published the article on LinkedIn, it was really one of the most difficult articles that I've had to publish because I think that the observations and critiques that follow in the article and in this podcast aren't easy to put forward. And that's partly because I once believed deeply in this messaging and in the messaging and the mission that I'm questioning here, and partly because I know this analysis will be received by some colleagues that I respect, and it'll be a little bit difficult pill to swallow. But the recent events have made this conversation rather unavoidable. So the current administration's executive orders targeting FEMA reform, the unprecedented scrutiny following major disasters like the LA fires or Hurricanes Helene and Milton, and the fracturing of this professional discourse I've witnessed firsthand have convinced me that emergency management itself faces a moment of reckoning. And so I honestly think that we can either have this conversation now on our own terms or have it forced upon us by external pressures that may not be as generous with the nuance or context that's required. And so the profession I care about deserves the chance to examine itself honestly before others do it for us. So let's get right into it. And what we're going to talk about today is the burden of criticism and how external pressure is fracturing the emergency management community from within. Something revealing happened in the emergency management community during recent major disasters. While response teams were conducting life-saving operations, a different kind of storm was brewing on social media. And I think if we all reflect and recall what was happening earlier in 2025, we know this was happening. This was not just the usual conspiracy theories about FEMA camps or government overreach, but professionals within emergency management questioning each other's authority and credentials in public forums. The profession that prides itself on coordination was tearing itself apart in public view, and it was really just getting started. Even the FEMA administrator said in early October that this was, quote, absolutely the worst I've ever seen. And that was in October 2024, which was describing the misinformation that followed Hurricanes Helene and Milton. But she was talking about external attacks, these conspiracy theories and political weaponization of disaster response. What she didn't mention, and what emergency management leaders don't necessarily discuss, is that the most damaging criticism isn't coming from outside the profession anymore. It was coming from within. And this is where we start to see the fracture lines emerge. So if you watch emergency management social media during any major disaster now, and you'll witness something unprecedented. A profession often seen as cannibalizing itself under pressure. The external criticism claims that FEMA is giving victims of Hurricane Helene only $750, or that FEMA is confiscating supplies, or that the agency prioritizes certain groups over others, has created internal fractures that reveal uncomfortable truths about what emergency management actually is and who gets to speak for it. University of Akron's Stacy Willett noted that what has changed is both the increase and speed of miscommunication. She was talking about public misinformation, but the same dynamic is destroying professional unity within emergency management itself. Criticism moves faster than coordination, and the profession is losing the ability to present a unified response to legitimate questions about its effectiveness. And the stakes couldn't really be higher. With 90 major disaster declarations in 2024, one of the worst years on record, according to the International Institute for Environment and Development, Criswell is acknowledging that we no longer have disaster seasons, we are busy year-round. Emergency management faces unprecedented demand for its services while simultaneously losing internal coherence about what those services actually are. In North Carolina, FEMA had to pause relief operations because of threats against personnel. A man was arrested for threatening employees after consuming false social media reports. But while emergency managers focused on external threats, the profession was quietly eating itself alive over questions of authenticity, authority, and accountability that it had never adequately addressed. And so we have the authority problem. And here's what emergency management, I guess I say as a field, doesn't really want you to know, is that nobody can actually agree on who actually represents the profession anymore. Is it the federal coordinators who control big money and policy decisions but rarely see ground level operations? Or is it the state directors with comprehensive responsibilities but limited operational experience? Or is it local emergency managers who run the day-to-day response but lack broader perspectives? Or is it the academics who study the field but get dismissed for not, quote, working real disasters? Or is it consultants who advise multiple agencies but serve no community directly? Or, and this represents a newer development that concerns traditional emergency managers, individuals who have built substantial social media followings by discussing disasters and emergency management topics. During major disasters, some of these voices achieve greater public reach than official agency communications, effectively shaping how communities understand emergency management operations. Traditional emergency managers largely dislike this development, but they can't ignore it. When official communications struggle to reach audiences beyond professional circles, and influencers regularly achieve viral reach discussing the same topics, who really speaks for emergency management? And so the question is fracturing professional conferences, social media discussions, and even workplace conversations. It's a crisis of authority, so to speak, happening precisely when the profession most needs to speak with a unified voice. The authority crisis isn't just a symptom. The real problem runs deeper to the heart of how emergency management has presented itself to the world versus what it actually does when a disaster strikes. For decades, emergency management has sold itself using heroic language. Budget requests emphasize saving lives. Grant applications highlight protecting communities. And conference presentations celebrate emergency managers as guardians of public safety. Recruitment materials promised careers dedicated to serving others in their darkest hours. And so the messaging worked very well. It worked perfectly. When emergency management operated mostly behind the scenes, it secured funding, it attracted talent, and it built institutional support. And that's how I even got started in the field. And so politicians loved writing checks to, quote, lifesavers. Communities supported agencies that promised to, quote, protect them. Media coverage celebrated emergency managers as unsung heroes working tirelessly to keep people safe. Then Hurricane Helene hit, and the messaging collided with reality. When false claims about that FEMA assistance that we previously mentioned was limited to $750, the agency's response was technically accurate. The amount represented immediate assistance for basic needs with additional programs available for housing and other damage. But the clarification missed what people actually wanted to know. Did you help us when we needed it the most? When questions arose about response coordination and resource allocation, emergency management voices emphasized jurisdictional boundaries, mutual aid protocols, and interagency complexity. And it's all technically correct, but completely beside the point. The public was asking a simpler question: did the system work when lives were on the line? And that's when the deception became more clear. When accountability arrived, emergency management retreated from heroic language that we had used in the past to bureaucratic explanations. We coordinate response efforts. We facilitate resource allocation, or we support primary responders. And we manage processes rather than control outcomes. The life-saving talk largely just disappeared, replaced by careful descriptions of roles, authorities, and limitations. And emergency management had spent years marketing itself as the cavalry, and then acted surprised when people expected them to ride to the rescue. And then we get to the scarcity secret. The contradiction runs even deeper than messaging problems. Emergency management has been hiding a fundamental truth about its evolving role, one that makes the heroic messaging not just misleading, but intellectually dishonest. As emergency management analyst Robert Roller noted in Domestic Preparedness, the increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters, coupled with the reemergence of military threats from peer and near-peer adversaries overseas, will greatly reduce the ability of emergency managers to meet the needs of disaster survivors. The profession is experiencing a paradigm shift in the primary role of emergency management, from the delivery of resources to managing the scarcity of resources and making better use of them. Emergency management is shifting from providing help to rationing help, from resource delivery to resource denial, from here's what you need to sorry, we don't have enough. But has anyone told the public about this fundamental change? Are budget presentations explaining that emergency management is transitioning from service delivery to scarcity management? Do recruitment materials mention that the job is increasingly about saying no rather than yes? I would argue, of course not. The profession continues using life-saving language while privately planning for resource constraints. It promises protection while preparing for inadequacy. It markets hope while managing decline. And this isn't incompetence per se. This is just institutional dishonesty. Emergency management as an institution has been selling a product it knows it cannot deliver, using language that describes a mission it's quietly abandoning behind the scenes. This is where we start to get into a real reckoning about what's been happening. External criticism is forcing these hidden contradictions out into the open. When every decision faces real-time public scrutiny, when misinformation spreads faster than official responses, and when communities demand immediate answers about life and death outcomes, emergency management can't hide behind the same technical jargon and professional credentials anymore. The result is a profession in crisis, not just because of external attacks, but because those attacks are exposing internal fractures that were always there and continue to grow. Emergency managers are arguing about authority because they never clearly defined it. They're struggling with messaging because they never aligned their promises with their capabilities. They're fragmenting under pressure because they never built unity around honest principles. And some emergency managers are adapting by embracing transparency about limitations, consistency in messaging, and proactive community engagement. This is a very positive development. They're acknowledging the shift from resource delivery to resource management, explaining what coordination actually means, and building trust through honesty rather than heroic promises. A huge and fundamentally positive shift. But others are doubling down on the deception, retreating into professional insularity and technical language while continuing to use, quote, life-saving rhetoric when it serves their interests. They're treating external criticism as evidence of public ignorance rather than professional accountability, and viewing internal dissent as disloyalty rather than necessary reform. And so what does emergency management refuse to admit? In my view, the truth emergency management doesn't want to face is revealing that the profession has been living a bit of a lie for years. It promised more than it could deliver, claimed credit for outcomes beyond its control, and built institutional support on messaging that didn't necessarily match operational reality. The external pressure isn't destroying emergency management, it's exposing what was already broken, what was already there. The misinformation campaigns aren't creating professional divisions, they're revealing fault lines that were always there. The criticism isn't unfair, it's probably long overdue. Emergency management can either use this moment to rebuild itself on honest foundations, admitting limitations, clarifying roles, and aligning messaging with capabilities, or it can continue fragmenting while communities lose faith in the institutions that promise protection but deliver only coordination. The choice isn't just about professional survival. It's about whether emergency management can evolve into something communities actually need, or whether it will remain trapped by deceptions of its own. Communities facing increasing disasters deserve better than a profession that can't decide what it does. They deserve emergency managers who are honest about capabilities, clear about limitations, and united around serving the public good, even when that service involves uncomfortable truths about what protection actually means in an age of permanent crisis. The burden of criticism has arrived. How emergency management carries it will determine whether the profession has a future worth defending, or whether it will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And that's it for today's podcast. Thanks for listening to the Crisis Lab podcast. And if you want to find out more information about what we do, please head over to the Crisis Lab website at crisislab.io. And we'll see you next time.